Okay, turn to Proverbs chapter 5. As we get into Proverbs chapter 5, Solomon is going to talk about wisdom about marriage. He is going to cover some very intimate, touchy topics as he goes through Proverbs chapter 5. So as I thought about teaching through this, I thought this is going to be interesting. And then the teenagers ended up in here. I thought this is going to be even more interesting. But we're going to go through what we need to go through. There are some things I'm not going to hit in very high detail and depth. And if you need some help with those later, I can get to them. But we're going to hit the important points as we go through Solomon's wisdom about marriage. Again, remember, Solomon is leaving his wisdom to whom? To his sons. And so his desire is that his sons will listen, obey. The whole book is about, which is listening and obeying. Okay, so it all fits together. But he wants his sons to take the wisdom that he's giving him, and as Greg said, put it into practice and obey it. So he's covering topics in this first 9 chapters that are just fundamental for everything else he's going to cover after this. Now, he could have covered the wisdom about marriage like he does a lot of topics. If you want to study the tongue in Proverbs, what chapter would you go to? There isn't a good chapter. A lot of what he does in Proverbs, there are lots of good verses, but they're scattered throughout the book. And so, in fact, most of the commentaries that I've been working with in the study books, I'm deciding what I'm going to do when I get there, but they'll go through chapters 1 through 9, and once they hit chapter 10, most of them will break the rest of the book into topics and then start going from chapter to chapter, giving you all of Solomon's wisdom on that topic because he covers so many things in one chapter once he gets to chapter 10. But in this wisdom about marriage, he is going to spend a whole chapter because as he looks at his sons again, he's saying, this is foundational to the rest of your lives. This is so important. He's talking about this because of the danger that's found as we look in verse 3. Who is he going to go after as he goes through this chapter? What's he warning his sons about? Wicked women or forbidden women or foreign women. It all depends on your translation. Now, I start that way because, remember, Solomon is talking to his sons, not his daughters. But the principles apply to either one of the sexes going through here that he's going to give in here. The importance of marriage, the importance of staying outside of relationships outside of marriage, and how it is easy to get sucked into those things. So keep that in mind as we go through this. One commentator said this about this section: nothing in life so clouds our judgment and makes fools out of the wisest as succumbing to illicit passions. Adultery, relationships outside of marriage, all of those things, when people get involved in those, they throw away all caution, they throw away all scriptural wisdom. And what do people who are involved in relationships that they shouldn't be? I'm sure most of you know folks like that. What do they say about them? How do they deal with it? Maybe you don't know anybody. Y'all live in a bubble?
God understands.
God understands. Wants me to be happy. Bringing any bells for anybody here? How else do people deal with it?
Some people think say, well, that was for the Bible times. That our culture, it's different now, and it's just the normal.
Outside of biblical Christianity, is our culture different today? It's at least more overt, is it not? It's not that this stuff has never been around, but now people are proud at times of what they're having, these relationships that they're having. And it's become the norm. Is marriage the norm in our society nowadays with young people? What is the norm? You live together. And I had to face that. I faced it in my family with one of my children. I never thought I'd have to face that. And I remember talking to my son, who knew better. At least I thought he knew better. He'd been trained better. And you know what he did? He looked at me and he said, well, you know, Dad, it's complicated. What Solomon is going to tell his sons as he's getting into this passage is life gets very complicated when you don't follow the truth. And it causes heartache in our family. It caused great heartache. Now, I praise the Lord that things got settled and they got into the right place finally. But for 2 years, as a father, I was heartbroken working through this with my son, who I thought knew so much better, but the whole world's doing it, and it's normal. And it's almost like it's like kicking the tires at the used car sales lot now. You know, you got to check it out first to make sure it's going to work before you get serious about this relationship. And that's not how God designed things to be. So Solomon's going to get into that with his sons in a very, very graphic way in some of this chapter, but in a very, very detailed way to try and save them from the heartache that's coming. And the dynamic, again, it continues to be Solomon talking to his sons, and he is going to talk very passionately to his sons. This is his heartfelt wisdom that he's giving them. In fact, we're going to talk about that as we go through there. He actually changes the way he addresses them in a couple of places. And you could tell the personal force that's behind this. Now, isn't that ironic? Who is it that's giving wisdom to his sons about relationships with women? Solomon. Tell me what you know about Solomon and his relationships with women. Did he practice what he preached? How bad was it? Lainey says bad. How bad was it? What does Scripture tell us? It's just numbers. In pure numbers. How many wives did he have? 300 wives. He had almost a wife for every day of the year. I don't know what he did on Valentine's Day. I guess he had the money to have somebody else buy them all gifts. But not only did he have 300 wives, but what else did he have as a king? Concubines. And how many of those? 700 concubines. So as Solomon is looking at his sons and giving them wisdom about marriage, he is going to basically look at the biblical standard and say, you know what you should have? One woman with one man. That's unique enough in our conversation, in our culture now. And for life. Now, how does Solomon pull that off? Has he been an example? No, so it's only by the grace of God that his sons are going to take the wisdom of God, because as Solomon's life portrays for his kids, he didn't believe it enough to do it himself. And that's a hard sell. And you're going to see some of that, I think, even as we go through this chapter, him giving a heartfelt, godly wisdom to his kids, knowing that I blew it. And there's no going back with 300 wives and 700 concubines. I don't know how you fix that. Life's gotten complicated now. It's a mess, okay? So as Solomon comes, we need to understand that all of this is in the background. And again, he's going to tell them these kind of liaisons with women who are not your wife is going to cause great and tremendous pain. Does he know what he's talking about? Probably does. Now, as the king, he gets away with a lot of stuff that other normal people aren't going to get away with, but at the same time, he looks and he says, these relationships aren't good for you, it's not good for them. And so he warns his son not to follow, as we go through this passage, and be looking for this, not to follow their desires, but rather to obey instruction, the wisdom from the Word of God. When he asks them not to follow their desires, what is he telling them not to follow? Yeah, he's saying, don't follow your heart. And again, this is the one time of the year when I'm studying something, I could look at my wife and say, we've got to quit watching those Hallmark movies. Bad theology. You ever heard him say the heart wants what the heart wants? And Solomon's looking at his sons and saying, don't go there. Don't go down that road. You need to follow what God wants, regardless of what you think your heart wants, unless it squares with Scripture. And so all of this is what he's going to share as he goes through some of these things. And again, as we get to verse 3, we see the center topic, verse 3, chapter 5, verse 3. For the lips of the forbidden woman drip honey. Where were we first introduced to the forbidden woman? This isn't the first time we've seen her in Proverbs. Look back to Proverbs chapter 2, verses 16 through 20. This is where the theme is first touched on. Now, it's not taught on in depth. He only teaches on it for 4 or 5 verses. But he says, beginning in Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 16, so you will be delivered from the forbidden woman. And he's talking about if you live wisely. From the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death and her path to the departed. None who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life. So you will walk in the way of the good and keep the paths of the righteous. So he's already set up this forbidden woman with what kind of warnings? So if you get in this kind of a relationship, what's going to happen to you? Cold night, warm soup, sliders. I knew this was a mistake again. What's going to happen according to Solomon in verses 16 through 20? It's the path to death. Is it really? Yeah, it will ruin your life, and it will. He's literally talking very specific and literal when he looks at his kids. He said, it will take your life eventually if you're not careful. What else does he say to them? What about the character of these ladies that look so appealing to his sons? And again, it could be the wrong men that women are looking at, but what is it about the character? What is he trying to teach them? If they're willing to get into a wrong relationship with you, what does he say there in these verses?
Watch out for their smooth words.
They've got smooth words. We're going to see that again. In verse 3, it talks about her lips dripping with honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. And the idea is they're flattering words. How do relationships like this get started? You know, people flatter you. Again, I think I read that one time. They tell you what you want to believe about yourself. You know, and as somebody else is telling you that, it's like, hey, and in the connection of this passage, he's looking at a son, and it appears he's looking at a son that is either married or is anticipating marriage. And he's saying, be careful of people outside the marriage relationship that come with smooth, flattering words telling you exactly what you want to hear about you, because it's going no place good. Okay, what else does it say in that passage? One or two more things, and then we'll jump back into chapter 5. What's happened in chapter 2, verse 17? Yeah, when we look at marriage again, we're going to talk about that in just a second and then jump into that. But what is marriage? It's a covenant. What kind of covenant? What are the details surrounding that covenant? When you have a marriage covenant, what's taking place there?
Making promises to God.
Yeah, get what Lainey said there. Too often, sometimes we look and we think we're making promises to whom instead of God. We're promising each other something, and that's important. But what Lainey is hitting there is exactly right. We're making promises to God. We have a covenant not only with our spouse, but a covenant before God. And so God takes covenants very seriously, and we won't take the time because it's already 10 to 7. But even outside of marriage, if you look at any covenant that's made in the Old Testament, God says, don't do it, and if you do it, you better keep it because I'm watching. And we're going to even see that in this passage. So it's a covenant before God as we go to marriage. And who created the marriage covenant? Whose idea was that? That's God's idea. Look back at Genesis chapter 2. Again, as we get into this passage, it's important to have all the foundations we're thinking through. And most of the stuff we know, but it's a good reminder. Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. God had finished all the creation, and when he finished all the creation, at the end of chapter 1, he said what? It was good. He looked at his creation and said, this is good. And the good is the same word as he uses later when he's making the covenant with Israel, and he talks about the benedictions and the favorable things that will happen to them. So God looks at his creation and says, it's all favorable. It's all good. What I have done is a wonderful creation. And the first thing he finds that is not good, if you look down in chapter, in that same chapter, starting in verse 20, it says, the man gave the names to all the livestock and to the birds of heaven and every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. And the idea in the Hebrew behind that, not found a helper fit, is actually the idea of the curse, or this is bad. This is the first thing God looks at and says, this is bad. He didn't create anything bad, but for man to be alone in God's eyes was a bad thing. So God does what?
Breaks his rib.
He takes his rib, and out of his rib he makes a woman, the perfect woman for Adam, and brings him to Adam. It's interesting because who do we told as being man's best friend? The dog came by, and what did God say? Not fit for Adam, okay? It's not going to work. So don't find your companion. And those of you who are dog lovers, I'm sorry. But dogs are great, but there was nothing in all of creation. And so God created the perfect helpmeet for Adam, brought Eve to him, and then he says, this is how I want this to work. Verse 24, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So the marriage covenant is ordained by God way back in Genesis 2 with the very first couple. Because you look at this, and I wonder if Adam and Eve didn't scratch their heads a little bit. It says, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother. Who were they leaving? Ever think about that? Adam and Eve had no father and mother. But even as God ordains this covenant of marriage, he's looking forward, and he's saying the time is going to come when it's time for marriage. You leave your father, you leave your mother, and you do what? How did he put it in Genesis chapter 2? Hold fast to one another. Some of you are married. Some of you have been married. Some of you may have lost spouses. Is marriage always easy? You remember the day you were married? I remember getting married. My wife's not in here. I won't get in trouble later. I remember the day I was married, and we were married in her backyard. And they had built a gazebo back there, and I remember standing there at the gazebo with my best friends, and her brother was my best man, so he was making sure I didn't go anywhere. And I'm standing there nervous and wondering what's going to happen next, and then my wife shows up with her dad. And there's just, your heart flutters. And you think, is she really going to come down that aisle and say, I do, with me on the other end of this? Is this really happening? And you come down, and as the preacher helps you with your vows, and you're forgetting what you're supposed to be saying, at least I was, and you're going through all of that, in your mind, you're just thinking, this life is wonderful. It doesn't get any better than this. And then a few weeks later, what happens? Everybody says, my life was still wonderful. What's wrong with you, Pastor? Some reality set in, do they not? You find out this person who had these lovely vows, it was all dressed up. They squeezed the toothpaste in the wrong place. He doesn't put his socks away. He drops them on the floor and leaves them right where he dropped. What kind of? Even the dog picks up after himself better than that. And stuff starts happening. And so as God institutes marriage, he says, I have one man for one woman for life, and I want you to do what? I want you to hold fast. There's going to be challenges. There's going to be things that will come into your relationship that Solomon's going to talk about that will challenge your relationship. But marriage is a covenant. And I've often told my wife, I will never divorce you. I might shoot you someday, but I'll never divorce you because it's till death do us part. And that's exactly where it needs to be. Now, it ought to be a wonderful relationship, so don't take all that as being bad. I'm painting the worst case scenario, obviously. But are there times when your spouse is ill? You ever had to, and I know some of you have, but have you ever had to care for an ill spouse because they were just too ill to care for themselves? That marriage covenant is tested. That love and that commitment that you made before God can be tested. And we give the vows out, but how many of you really think about the opposite side of the vows as you're giving them? I'm marrying you for richer or for... How many of you wanted to be poor when you did that vow? None of us thought we were going to be poor. I don't remember the other day something came on and my wife was watching and it was a rich man. I said, yeah, if you thought you were marrying money, you really messed up. And she just smiled funny, made me a little nervous. But, for in sickness and in health, how many of you are thinking, boy, I hope that my spouse just gets really sick and I get to care for them for a long, long time? But that's the vow that we made. And God, as he's looking at this and establishing this, is saying, I want you to hold fast. I want you to become one flesh. Did it work really well for Israel? Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 11. And the Pharisees came to Jesus, and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Now, why would they ask him that question? They're trying to trick him. Why divorce? Why that question? I mean, they tried to trick him with other questions, like the Sabbath question we looked at on Sunday. Why, when they're really after him near the end of the book of Matthew, when they want to turn the people against Jesus Christ, do they ask him a question like, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? What are they after? Why is that an important topic? There's lots of possible answers. Well, they wanted to blaspheme, but there's something much more simple at the surface that they're up to right now. Jesus Christ has quite a following. What are they trying to do? Undermine him with other people. So what does that tell you about the state of marriage in Israel at this point? Because they don't even say, is it lawful to divorce your wife? What did they say? For any cause. Marriage had become such a thing in Israel at this time, and it goes all the way back to Moses. So this has been for hundreds of years. It wasn't as bad, I don't think, when Moses started this. But Moses allowed them, and he's going to talk about that, to divorce one another because of the hardness of their hearts. It got so bad that if your wife burned dinner and you just didn't please her, you could divorce her for any cause. And so they come to him thinking, okay, now Jesus is in trouble with somebody here. If he looks and says, in this society where these men are with these women and these men are divorcing their wives for pitiful reasons, for petty reasons, and Jesus looks and says, no, it is not lawful to have divorce for any cause, what's happened to part of his contingency? Got it out. We're in the middle of politics. Are politicians careful how they answer questions? How many times do they really answer the question? They dance around it because answering the question could cause trouble. And so they bring him a question that they know is going to cause trouble. And look what he says in verse 4. Have you not read that he created them from the beginning and made them male and female? We probably should have that out on the billboard somewhere. You know, have people not noticed that God made people male and female, and that's the way couples are supposed to work? But then he said in verse 5, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Where did Jesus get that from? He's quoting Genesis chapter 2. He goes all the way back to the beginning. And they're like, wait a minute, this isn't the question we had. So he goes on. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What God therefore hath joined together, let not man separate. So what is Jesus' answer to that question? You really aren't paying attention to me, are you? What's his answer to the question about divorce? Man shouldn't be doing that. Man has no authority to take apart what God put together because the covenant is between God and this couple. He goes on. Then they asked him, then why did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce to send her away? And he said, because of the hardness of your hearts. Let that sink in a little bit. Who was allowed to divorce because of the hardness of their hearts? God's people. Because they were so intent on doing something that God never intended them to do that they hardened their hearts, and then Moses finally let them get away with writing a writ of divorce because their hearts were so hard and they were so intent upon doing that. But Jesus says in verse 9, or in verse 8, at the end of the verse, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So what is he saying by that? God never intended this, ever. In fact, he goes on to say, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Is that what the Pharisees had in mind when they started this conversation? It's gone a lot further than they intended, and they get real quiet again like they normally do when Jesus is finished teaching. And look at the way the disciples, and I bring that all up because this is all going to be foundational to what we're about to look at quickly in Proverbs chapter 5. Because what was the disciples' reaction in verse 10 of Matthew chapter 19? The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. So what's their reaction to this? Jesus said, if you make a commitment, keep it. If you make a covenant, keep it. And how did the disciples react? Now this is basic men thinking, okay? What did they say? You really are not awake. And there's only a few of you, so it's really making me nervous. He looks at him, they look up and say, then why are we getting married? We shouldn't get married. And Jesus goes on to say, not everyone can receive that saying. Because God has intended most folks for marriage. There are some that have a gift of celibacy, that can remain single. Most people, God's intent is that you have a spouse, that they complete you, just as Adam and Eve, that you have this companionship throughout life, this companionship with somebody that you made a covenant with before God, and you are endeavoring with all of your being, with God's power empowering your life, to be faithful to that commitment. Through good things and bad, through difficult things and wonderful things. And the last thing to think about as we get into this, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. What does God think of marriage? He said, let marriage be held in honor among all. Is that the case in our society today? It's not. And so as Christians, we are going against the flow of our society. But it says very clearly at the end of Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, God will judge the sexually immoral and the adulterous. God is going to judge. Do folks believe that? Most people just think they've gotten away with it, and it's okay. I'm going to take just a minute, and then I'm going to jump in. We're not going to spend a lot of time in Proverbs chapter 5, but we're going to get through the chapter tonight. But I read this as I was studying this on the basics of a Christian marriage from R.C. Sproul, and it's just about one page, but I think it's worth thinking about as we get into Proverbs chapter 5. It says, today, of course, many young people not only are saying no to the traditional wedding ceremony, they're rejecting the concept of marriage itself. More and more young people are coming from broken homes, and as a result, they have a fear and skepticism about the value of marriage. So we see couples living together rather than marrying for the fear that the cost of that commitment may be too much. They fear it may make them too vulnerable. This means that one of the most stable and, as we have once thought, permanent traditions of our culture is being challenged. One of the things I like most about a traditional wedding ceremony is that it includes an explanation as to why there is such a thing as marriage. We are told in that ceremony that marriage is ordained and instituted by God. That is to say, marriage did not just spring up arbitrarily out of social conventions or human taboos. Marriage was not invented by men, but by God. We see this in the earliest chapters of the Old Testament where we find the creation account. We find that God creates in stages, beginning with the light and capping the process with the creation of man. At every stage, he utters a benediction, a good word. God repeatedly looks at what he's made and says, that's good. But when God notices something that provokes not a benediction, but what is called a malediction, that is a bad word, what this thing was that God saw in his creation that he judged to be not good, we find in Genesis 2:18, where God declares it's not good that man should be alone. That prompts him to create Eve and bring her to Adam. God instituted marriage, and he did it in the first instance as an answer to human loneliness. For this reason, God inspired Moses to write, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. But while I like and appreciate the words of the traditional wedding ceremony, I believe the form of the ceremony is even more important. That's because the traditional ceremony involves the making of a covenant. The whole idea of covenant is deeply rooted in biblical Christianity. The Bible teaches that our very redemption is based on a covenant. Much could be said about the character of the biblical covenants, but one vital facet is that none of them is a private matter. Every covenant is undertaken in the presence of witnesses. This is why we invite guests to our weddings. It is so that they will witness our vows and hold us accountable to them. It is one thing for a man to whisper expressions of love to a woman when no one will hear, but it is quite another thing for him to stand up in a church in front of parents, friends, ecclesiastical or civil authorities, and God himself, and there make promises to love and cherish her. Wedding vows are sacred promises made in the presence of witnesses who will remember them. I believe marriage is the most precious of all human institutions. It is also the most dangerous. Into our marriages, we pour our greatest and deepest expectations. We put our emotions on the line. There we can achieve the greatest happiness, but we can also experience the greatest disappointment, the most frustration, and the most pain. With that much at stake, we need something more solemn than a casual promise. Even with formal wedding ceremonies, even with the involvement of authority structures, roughly 50% of all marriages fail. Sadly, among the men and women who stay together as husband and wife, many would not marry that same spouse again, but they stay together for various reasons. Something has been lost regarding the sacred and holy character of the marriage covenant. In order to strengthen the institution of marriage, we might want to consider strengthening the wedding ceremony with a clear biblical reminder that marriage is instituted by God and forged in his sight. There was a lot to think about and contemplate that R.C. Sproul shared, and that was shared quite some years ago. So we get into chapter 5, verses 1 through 16. Let's begin looking at what's there and get through the passage. First of all, we have a father's warning in verses 1 through 6. My son, be attentive to my wisdom and incline your ear to my understanding, that you may keep discretion and your lips may guard knowledge. Is it the first time we've heard that kind of instruction and that kind of a phraseology in the book of Proverbs? No, we've heard it several times, haven't we? In fact, I wrote down somewhere. He uses it in chapter 1, verse 8, in chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, chapter 3, verse 1, chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. So often as Solomon begins teaching in this book, he begins with, listen to what I have to say. But there's a slight difference in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 5 from all the other times in the book. Can anybody pick up on what it is? I read it in the commentary, so I cheated. It's basically the same except for one small nuance.
It's
That's exactly, well, you're better than I am. I had to read that. Yeah, it's very personal. I would talk to you about the fact that Solomon has made huge mistakes in his life in this area. And as he talks to his kids about this, it's very personal because instead of just saying, be attentive to wisdom, what does he say? Be attentive to my wisdom. Now, is he making this stuff up or is this from God? It's from God, but he's experienced this. He's experienced the flip side of this as well. And so as he comes to his sons, he says, be attentive to my wisdom. Incline your ear to my understanding, that you may keep what? Discretion. Why is discretion so important as he's about to talk about marriage?
Indiscreet is a word for anything sexual outside of marriage.
Okay, so you don't want to be indiscreet. It's discretion because it's going to be very public. So if you're going to make a vow in public, what are you supposed to do? Keep it. So he's saying use some discretion before you do this. But he's not saying don't do this. In fact, we're going to get to the end of this chapter, and there's a wonderful passage in here about how important it is to do this. Why he feels marriage is such a wonderful thing. So keep that in mind as we go through. But he's saying you need to keep discretion and guard knowledge. And the idea is to keep it and hold it fast as we get into this area of relationships. He comes to verse 3 through 6 and says the following. Goes right from that, for the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path to Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. So he begins talking about this forbidden woman. As we look back at Proverbs chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, what do we know about the forbidden woman? Who is this? Who is he talking about?
Calls it the adulteress.
The adulteress, and so does Proverbs chapter 2 if you look back there. Calls her an adulterous woman. So what is the implication of this woman who's trying to seduce Solomon's son? And again, she's a picture of everything out there that could happen. It's not a specific woman, I don't think, that he had in mind. But what is her marital status? She's married. Okay, now these same principles can apply to relations before marriage, but he's looking and saying, you've got this married woman who, because she's married, she ought to be off limits. So Proverbs is calling her the forbidden woman. Yes?
Do you suppose Solomon knew the story of David and Bathsheba?
I assume since Bathsheba was Solomon's mother, he probably knew that story. And that probably fits a good point. It probably fits into all that's in here. Because Solomon's sons have grandparents that didn't set much better an example for him than his parent did they? And so he looks, and again, my wife and I were talking about this a little bit the other day. It amazes me when you think about this generational issue in this family. David committed adultery with Bathsheba. The result was, lost that child, but eventually the result becomes Solomon. Solomon goes through and asks God for wisdom, takes over the kingdom. He's not supposed to, he's told two things if we go back. There's lots of things, but two primary things that kings did that he wasn't to do. Don't multiply horses and don't multiply wives. And what does he do? He's got the biggest collection of horses in the world in his day, and he's got 300 wives and 700 concubines. And yet you look at all of this and you say, is there any hope for this family? What was David known as?
After God's own heart.
What's the warning for us in that? Did David not love God? David loved God. He was a man after God's own heart. And yet what happened to David?
He had a really messed up family life.
Yeah, his family life was really messed up, and one day when he belonged on the battlefield, he was up on the top of the roof, and he was looking at things he shouldn't be looking at, and it led to adultery. And again, his family got more messed up than it was even before that point at that time. And so does Solomon know of what he speaks when he's sharing this wisdom with his sons? When he talks about the heartache, does he know what it means? He does. And so again, he's looking at folks like sitting in our back rows here, and I didn't plan on you guys being here today, but you're here anyway. He's looking at those younger folks. He's saying, you got to take marriage seriously. You got to take it for God, what God wants it. Some of you are sitting here, look, give me a break. I'm only 14 or 15. It'll come, okay? But it's foundational that we know going into relationships. And those of us who are married know that God intended that to be for life, and there's reasons. He's going to go into some of that, and hopefully we'll get to that. I didn't want to take 2 weeks in this chapter. But anyway, he goes on, he talks about the fact that this forbidden woman, as she talks, as she drips honey and is smoother than oil, and again, that's the idea of she's really a smooth talker. She knows how to flatter. You know, and what's the saying? Flattery will get you nowhere. I don't know who said that, but I think they missed the boat on it, because sometimes it'll get you where you don't need to be. Okay, and so Solomon's looking, he said, beware when people are flattering you, because it sounds really good, but in verse 4, what is it like? In the end, what is it? Wormwood. Wormwood was very bitter. It's a symbol of bitterness in the Bible. So that which looks like it's going to be exciting and which looks like it's going to be emotionally wonderful becomes something that leads to all kinds of bitterness. It also says there that it's as a two-edged sword. Now, where have we seen that phrase before? This is not the same two-edged sword of Hebrews, okay? Hebrews chapter 4, the word of God is like a two-edged sword, but the idea is the same. The word of God cuts and divides asunder soul and spirit, joint and marrow, intents of the heart. What does this sword do? It destroys, it cuts away. And it's interesting. And again, I don't understand all the nuances of Hebrew, but the word here for that sword, that two-edged sword, comes from a Hebrew word that talks about having an open mouth to devour. And the idea is that the sword will devour your life, and it's two-edged. It'll get you coming and going. And so Solomon looks at this situation and tells his sons, beware. It'll ruin your life. It'll take you down to the grave. She doesn't ponder the paths of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. Somebody who's not going on the right path, and Solomon's been talking about paths all the way through here, going on the right path and a wrong path and doesn't know it is called what in this book? You only got two paths, and you're either a wise person on the right path or you are a fool on the wrong path. And he looks and says, it may sound good, she may look good, she's a fool on the wrong path, and the problem is she doesn't even know it. Again, it goes both ways for both sexes as you're looking at this, so just be aware that Solomon is warning about those who aren't trying to do things God's way. And then, in the end of it, he's saying there's a tremendous price to be paid, so beware. Now look at the father's warning in verses 7 through 14. He's going to warn of ruin and regret. You ever know anybody who's been unfaithful outside of their marriage and suddenly gets caught in all of it? How many of them are happy and ecstatic and having a great time? There's ruin at the end. It sounded so good when it was clandestine, when it was hidden from people around them. But when it comes to light, Solomon's going to say this beginning in verse 7. And now, O sons, listen to me. Why is he so passionate there? Because the heart wants what the heart wants. And he's saying, get out of the heart, get into the head that goes in and changes the heart, and listen to what I have to say to you. And do not depart from the words of my mouth. Now, why that picture? He's saying, listen to me and don't depart. Well, what's behind that?
When you're not around me, don't forget what I taught you.
Yeah, when they are around him, what do things look like? Do they know the truth? Yeah, he's looking, saying, you know the truth. How many people do you know that know the truth and depart from it and go the wrong way? And especially in this idea of illicit physical relationships. It happens all around. Our world's full of it. They have open marriages now, where you could be married and still have your side trysts and everything's okay. It's not okay with God. And so Solomon's looking at his kids and saying, don't go there. As wonderful as somebody may try to make it sound, it's the ways of death. It's the ways that are going to lead you to destruction and ruin. And he says in verse 8, keep your way far from her and don't go near the door of her house. Is there a spiritual principle there for us? Flee. Flee fornication, Paul said. Stay away from it. You know what else is very dangerous in our day and age? That does the same thing as this forbidden woman? Pornography is extremely dangerous. God uses it in the same way. You could almost plug that in for the forbidden woman here, because it destroys marriages, it destroys covenants, and you need to do what? You need to flee from it. In our society, again, is encouraging these kind of relationships, and it often begins that way. You can get it on television. You get it on commercials almost if you're not careful watching things nowadays. The world is bombarding us with it, and so we need to look at this and say, I need to flee from that. Whatever it takes to stay away from it. If we can't get away from it any other way, take your phone out and step on it. The problem is these temptations have become such that they are so accessible to this generation. And we need to be preaching and teaching, and it's kind of embarrassing to talk about it. So we don't talk about it much. And instead, we look the other way while Satan uses it as a tool. And not just with our young people. Marriages are torn apart by this kind of thing. And so we need to take this very seriously when Solomon looks and says, don't go near the door of that house. Stay away from it, because initial obedience that flirts too close to the edges of these temptations is asking for trouble. And that's what he's trying to convey to his kids. He goes on in verse 9. He says, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the merciless, lest strangers take their fill of your strength and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. So he's looking and saying, if you're involved in these adulterous, illicit relationships, where's the end of all that? Where does it lead? Poverty? You lose your reputation, your honor is taken away. Not so much now in our society as it should be, but with respectable people. And then he goes on and says, lest strangers take their fill of your strength and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. What's he saying there? There's a price to be paid. As simple as you get married and you violate your marriage relationship and you lose your marriage. Anybody know somebody who has to pay alimony and whines about it all the time? Solomon's warning, saying that's part of it. That's not the worst part of it, but that's part of it. So be careful. It will destroy your lives if you're not careful. And then he goes on in verses 11 through 14 as he's finishing this avoiding ruin and regret with his sons, and says, and at the end of your life, when you look back, will you have regrets or will you be satisfied with where things were? He says, at the end of your life, you groan. And that idea of groaning there is a word that's used elsewhere of groaning, moaning, or growling like a wild beast that's been mortally wounded and has no place to go. He said, you're going to groan. You're going to be in agony over what happened. And you say, how I hate discipline. How I hated discipline, and my heart despised reproof. He's going to look back and say, all this stuff I told you, you thought it was nonsense and you hated it. Now you're looking back and saying, oh, if I had only heeded and listened. When my dad asked me to listen, chapter after chapter, all that I'd only done, don't get there. He said in verse 13, I did not listen to the voice of my teachers or incline my ear to my instructors. Why does Solomon keep going back to that again and again and again? It's at least 5 or 6 times, and we're only in chapter 5, and he keeps saying, listen to me, pay attention, obey these things. Why does he have to hit it so hard? Are his kids that stupid they didn't get it the first time? What's the issue?
Number one, they may not believe it.
Okay, do they believe? Well, look at Solomon. He's not very credible in this area.
Look at teenagers. We all remember being a teenager and...
Plug your ears.
Yeah, well, we looked at our parents and our people around us, the adults around us, and we thought, nah.
Yeah, what do they know? And so Solomon's not only telling him, listen to me, but who else does he tell him to listen to? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Saying, keep God first. Because when these kind of temptations come in your life, do you think with your head or do you think with your heart? And if your heart's in the wrong place, you're in trouble. You're going to end up going down the wrong road. And then he says in verse 14, I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation. So you want to end up with a life, you look back and say, my life has been wasted, then ignore this stuff and do whatever you want. Get into whatever relationships you want, and you'll get to the end, and they'll be moaning, and they'll be groaning. Is there a price to be paid in lives, even if you try to get your life straightened out for the Lord afterwards, if you've gone down this road? There are consequences. And those consequences are hurtful, and they're great. And so Solomon's looking at his sons and saying, don't go there. Because so many people end up struggling with that. And God can work, and God gives grace, and God is merciful. But Solomon's saying, don't get to the point where you need that in this area. Be very careful about where you go. And then we get this father's advice to find satisfaction at home. Look at verses 15 through 23. And again, I'm going to read through this. I'm not going to give you a lot of explanations of what's being said here because he gets very, very intimate in what he has to say. But I want to look at the principles that are here. Verse 15, drink water from your own cistern and flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the street, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. What in the world is Solomon talking about? He's talking about the marital relationship. And as he looks at that, he's comparing what you have in the intimacy of marriage with cisterns and wells. Now again, you've got to take yourself back to Solomon's day. How important to you is a cistern? Do you know what a cistern is?
Catches water.
Catches water. How many of you have a cistern at home? Okay, in this day, you had to have a well or a cistern. Why? Water was critical for life. And so Solomon's looking and saying, one of the most important, how many days can you go without water? 3, 4. The nurse says 4. I've heard 3. You can't go very long, okay? You can go 40 days and 40 nights, I know from Scripture, without eating, but you can't go without water. Water is life. And Solomon's looking and saying, one of the most important things that belongs to you, your well, your cistern, wherever it is you're getting your water, that ought to be the way that you value that marital relationship. And if you don't have one yet, that ought to be the way that you look forward to valuing that marital relationship. It is the most precious thing that you have. The relationship that you have with the spouse is the most important relationship that you have outside of your relationship with Jesus Christ. And you need to treasure it. And you need to take care of it. And he's going to go on to talk about this. And you need to find all of your needs met at home. Now, some of those are physical needs, and I'm not going to go into all that tonight. But those are there. Those are also emotional needs. Do people ever wander from their marital covenant over emotional needs? And again, that's why we need to be so careful to be what we ought to be with our spouses at home. They ought to have all of those needs met at home. And that's what Solomon's beginning to say here. He says, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers. Don't be finding your needs being met outside of that marital relationship at home. It needs to be there. Verse 18, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe, let her breast fill you at all times with delight and be interested always in her love. And without going into the intricacies again of what's going on here, Solomon's saying that you need to treasure your spouse in such a way that that is the most important relationship that you have. You need to care for that relationship. You need to respect that relationship. You need to make sure that you don't let anything from the outside come in or find yourself wandering from that relationship. And that wandering often begins with what? Go back to verse 3. Well, it begins in the mind, but what happened? What starts that thing off in the first place? You're having trouble at home, maybe. You're having a little bit of a spat. We'll make it easy. It's over toothpaste, okay? Well, you're squeezing the toothpaste in the wrong place. I know most spats are over something much more serious than that. But you're having issues at home, and you're not finding what you need to find at home. And what happens? Somebody comes along with flattering words. My wife came home, and I kind of chuckled because I was preparing this. I don't think she knew I was on this chapter because she's in with the kids. But there was a guy she works with at Aldi's. And I met this guy one time. Now, the other day, he went up to my wife and told me how lovely her hair was. And she's like, she comes home and says, you know what? And I kind of got the message that I dropped the ball at home, okay? But you know what one of the coworkers said to me today? They told me how lovely my hair was. And then she looked at me. And as a young kid, I'm sitting there saying, what does she want? Oh, she wants me to reflect on how lovely her hair was. But she ought to be getting that from me at home. Okay, and then the other day he did the opposite, which I thought, okay, now at least I'll let him live. But she went in the other day. He's only met me once. He met me once for about 2 or 3 minutes. I went into Aldi's. I was looking for my wife. She was in the back doing something. He's out front. And I asked him, do you know where Krista Bond is? I need to talk to her. It's important. And he's like, who? And I said, Krista Bond. And then I remembered, this was the guy that likes the treats that she takes into work. I said, Betty Crocker. Oh, she's in the back. Okay. But the other day he went up to her and he said something to the effect of, I met your husband. He's a really nice guy. How did you ever get a really nice guy like that? Now, I know better. I stand amazed that I'm still married. I wouldn't be married to me after 37 years. But I hear those flattering words. Now, it's a guy, so that doesn't do that. But she goes and hears flattering words from somebody. And what does Satan use that? How does he use that? It's like all those flattering words are like, well, why didn't my husband tell me that? We've been married 37 years. And too often I find myself like the joke, where the wife comes, do you love me? And it's like, well, I told you 37 years ago I loved you. If it changes, I'll let you know. It doesn't work that way. And so Solomon in this chapter is part of what he's doing in these verses here, besides painting this picture of what marriage is supposed to be, is painting a picture of how we're supposed to care for our spouse and care for the needs of our spouse. Not only physically, but emotionally. What is the number one reason we see in Genesis chapter 2 that God created Eve? What did God say?
It was not good.
What was not good? Man should be alone. So why was that spouse created primarily? Relationship. Companionship. And what Solomon is doing here is saying, don't let physical desires, don't let emotional desires carry you outside that covenant bond of marriage. Find relationship in that covenant that you've made. Now, it's not in Proverbs chapter 5. It'll be later in the book. But what does that mean to us? Those of us who are married, I'll give the teens a break because they're not quite there yet. Some of you will be before you know it. I got to be 60 before I knew it. It happens fast. What does that mean to us? What should we do with Solomon's? Number one, we should stay away from any kind of relationship that would detract us from our spouse. But what else does that mean to us?
Think about our relationship with God.
If your relationship with God isn't right, your relationship with your spouse won't be right. It's got to start there. That's why the foundation's there in verse 1. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. What else does it indicate? Or what else should it teach us?
It's a gift from God.
It's a gift from God. What does it teach us about our responsibility?
That we have to be a steward over it, like everything else that he gives us is a good gift.
Okay. And being a steward over our relationship, in our covenant relationship in marriage, what does that mean? We ought to treasure our spouse. I love the way that Solomon put it. He's talking to young people, but he's looking way down the road. He says, you need to be satisfied with the wife of your... What's he implying? Someday she's not going to look like she does now. Guess what? Neither are you. Okay? You're going to change. You're going to get older. And what's going to be the thing what may have attracted you originally was physical characteristics that you were just drawn to. But when you've been married for 30 or 40 or 50 years, my wife doesn't look at me and say, "Ooh, that guy's hot." I guarantee it, because I look in the mirror and I say, "Where'd this old guy come from?" What's he going to stand behind? Oh, that's not him. That's me. But what's going to hold that marriage together? What holds that relationship together? Cherishing one another. And it takes effort. Why is the seductive woman so successful so often? She puts in the effort. She gives attention. And so we need to give attention to that covenant relationship that God, whether we've been married 5 days, 5 years, 50 years, or more, there needs to be attention given to that spouse and that covenant relationship, cherishing them. And for husbands, as Christ cherished the church, and there's a whole message there that we don't have time for tonight because I'm already over. Yeah, lady, did you have something?
Remember when, I forget which church it was in Revelation, where Jesus says, he was scolding them, I have this against you, you've left your first love. Remember the things that you did at first and do them. I think that's a good...
I think that was the church at Ephesus, if I'm not mistaken.
That's a good tool in marriage also, to remember what it was in them that you fell in love with, and remember, you know, Jesus tells us all the time, remember. You know, it's a great teaching tool, but you have to do that with yourself too. Remember good memories to help you get through the hard times.
And there will be. Good. Other thoughts? I know we're a couple minutes over, so, but yeah, Bruce.
Okay, I'm assuming you're going to skip quickly to the end, but when you started, you mentioned people were pointing to what we used to call shack up nowadays a lot. Some years ago, James Dobson, when he was still head and focused on the family, on his radio program, he talked about a survey that they had done. And they found that people who lived together before marriage had a higher divorce rate than people who had not. And it took me a while, but I think I might have figured out why. And those of us of my age, when all this shacking up business started to be normalized in the 60s, we remember watching that and some of the results of it. And there is no, well, the way it was justified is we'll go this way, and if it doesn't work, we'll just split. Okay? We watched that for decades. It turns out that I don't think there is a switch in the human mind that you can turn that off. If you go into the marriage with that attitude, or before the marriage with that attitude, that inevitably carries over into the marriage.
Yeah. And that's the last two verses in this passage. Solomon says, be careful and don't go there, because verse 22, the iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. And you think you've got it under control, but you get to the point where you don't have control of the situation at all, whether it's a switch turning off or where you are ensnared by that kind of a lifestyle. In verse 23, goes on to say, he dies for lack of discipline, and because of his great folly, he's led astray. And it's nothing but regret and ruin if we don't follow God's plan. I saw anybody else before we finish up tonight? Again, this is kind of a interesting subject, but it's key for our lives and for our families.
I just think that there's so many people that get married that they're in love with themselves more than they are with the person that's standing on the other side of them. You know, it's, if you don't talk about your relationship with Christ before you get married,
Yep.
I've probably seen 1,000 weddings, and it's maybe 5% that talk about Jesus Christ in that ceremony.
That's why I like what Sproul said so much. He goes back to the fact that ceremony, whenever I get a chance to do a ceremony, I always want to go back to those key things on the covenant. You're making a covenant, and it's not just between the two of you. It's before God. And, hopefully you don't have bad days all the time, but even when you're not having the best of days, you need to remember, before God, I made a covenant to make this work, so it's my responsibility to take care of my end of this and make it work. And there's a lot of teaching we could do there, but won't do that tonight. Any other comments before we're closed? God places a high value on the sanctity of that marital commitment, and he expects us to keep it.